Last time, it seems like ages since we spoke, but last time we spoke was after you sent me photos of Simpson Lee House and the bushfires.
That's right.
And that seems like 1,000 years ago now.
Yeah, but it also lives in my memory very nearby.
Yeah.
Those fires were so dramatic, they were so catastrophic. When you think about the loss of habitat, 22% of our native forests, parkland in our national parks lost to fire, habitat lost, 1 billion estimated native animals died. What an incredible tragedy. And rainforests formed for the first time in the history of the development of those rainforests.
Yeah.
Extraordinary times.
It's interesting, isn't it? The pandemic has just taken all the conversation away from what was a worldwide acknowledged climate event. The fires were covered around the world. The fundraising was worldwide. The discussion was all about climate and climate change.
Yeah.
Then in the blink of an eye, that stopped and we all started talking about coronavirus, which I'm sure we'll all get through some way or another, and the climate problem will still be there. I gave a talk at UTS last week and I quoted Umberto Eco talking about climate change 12 years ago in a lecture that he gave.
Yes.
Simply saying that of all of the elements, fire in the form of heat is cooking the planet and causing a massive amount of catastrophic environmental events. And that was 12 years ago. And I think you're right. I think now's the time, while we're in the mood for change, which we clearly are, that we start really banging that drum hard and try to get, at least for what you and I do, try to get our buildings to work as well as they can environmentally.
Well, for my part, getting our buildings working environmentally reasonably well is no less important than being able to get waste out of the building and water supply in and things like that. It should be just an automatic part of thinking of how buildings work and how we respond. As I've always said, the design of our buildings should be breathing in many ways. We've got huge problems with our regulations that close our buildings down. Our buildings should leak air, and
That's
yet
right.
They're measured under the basic system to not leak air.
What are you working on at the moment? Anything exciting?
Well, the project in Lightning Ridge is going ahead.
Oh, great.
We're well on the way with documentation on that.
Fantastic.
It's entirely off the grid, and it's a fairly large building. It's going to be in the order of probably over $30 million.
Yep.
And we've got funding for a very good, a decent portion of it. We're looking for funding now for the next part of it, so we can do it all in one go.
Fantastic.
Doing a project in one go is more economic than having bites at it.
Oh yeah, well we both know that. You know that from the mosque. I mean that's a labour of over a decade's love. That's a hard road to hoe, that one.
Yeah, that's right.
That's exciting because that's been around for a while too, hasn't it?
2003.
Yeah.
And but we've been developing it, and we've got very good consultants that are working on it.
Yeah,
so,
good.
That's all good. Also got a Shaolin monks from China project for 50 monks down south of Nowra.
Fantastic.
It includes a Zen meditation space and kitchens and dining and accommodation and prayer areas and all sorts of things, which is a fabulous project.
Is that like a temple or is it a monastery?
Yeah, it's rather like it in the Christian world, like a monastery. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic.
They took me to China to see their headquarters.
Yeah.
In Dongfang, which was a fantastic place. They dressed me as a monk, and I lived as a monk for 10 days, which was extraordinary.
For someone from a flat city like Melbourne, it's Sydney's topography that's fantastic. And that causes a different streetscape, and it's a much older city than Melbourne. So finding those little bolt holes where there's half a dozen chairs, sitting out the front of a stainless steel bar in Sydney, usually with a Moreton Bay fig tree in the street, or a peppercorn tree, they're fantastic. I think you're being too hard on Sydney. I think it's a great city.
The topography is wonderful. There's no question about that. And Sydney Harbour is extraordinary.
Superb.
It's the lungs of the city. It's where the great summer nor'east breezes come through their heads there and drive up through Sydney Harbour and take all the muck out.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be making all that muck, but it does do it. And it's the most beautiful thing, that northeast breeze in summertime.
I also think, I mentioned this in my talk the other night at UTS, that area around Chippendale and where UTS is, there's some very well-renowned architects who've worked there, both Australian and international. And the general quality of the development of that part of Sydney is really good. And same with Barangaroo. I look at Melbourne now on our peripheries, and I see an awful lot of really quick building that's expedient.
Yes.
And it's changed the feel of Melbourne from a really beautiful gridiron city, along the lines of New York or Chicago, into something else. And I'm not convinced by it as a city anymore, because Sydney can't do that to itself. Sydney maintains its rigour purely because of its almost lack of order in its streetscape. In the 60s, when Sydney and Melbourne were growing, Harry Seidler in Sydney was a profound influence in terms of the cityscape, the skyscrapers that he did. I'm thinking of Australia Square.
Yes.
But there was also just the beginnings of murmurings about modernism needing to be reassessed, and that was probably happening in America more than anywhere. So, the subsequent 10 years saw change, and some of the change was needed because the international style work that was starting to appear wasn't very good, and it needed to be shaken up. But the Harry Seidler Tower, there are a couple of Harry Seidler buildings in Melbourne. One's at I think it's Glen Waverley or Mount Waverley Town Hall.
Yes,
The other is the old Shell House.
Yes.
They're beautifully built buildings too.
Yeah.
They're really beautifully put together buildings.
And they will still be good in 50 years' time.
I hope so. I hope they're left alone or looked after. Yeah. And it's not just an Australian thing. There's a phenomenon around the world where architects believe that every building has to outdo the previous one, and they make decisions that are profoundly about attention seeking. So they're screaming architecture with no necessarily logical rationale behind the decision making other than that. Yeah. But there's also conversely the work that is, speaking quietly about what the architectural proposition of the building might be. And I think we're going to see, to go back to what we were speaking about before, we're going to see now a really rigorous architecture coming out of climate, where a lot of stuff is invested into a building to get it to perform better. And that could be a really interesting time, because we might see buildings starting to change themselves completely to address the warming of the planet. So those buildings that scream architecture with a capital A, I don't think they've got much more time in the discourse. Or if they do, they're probably not going to be taken quite as seriously as they might have once upon a time. Yeah,
but one of the problems, Sean, in all this is I've always felt that the architecture that's built of the day is a measure of the culture. And it's not just architects. it's the client base selecting the sort of work. So until the culture of the public can change to a more sophisticated and understanding of the process of that junction between the rationale and the poetics that can occur in architecture. And until we've got those sort of clients, we're going to get the sort of stuff that's coming now. And that's the measure of our culture at the moment. And that's why it's happening.
I mean, projects like Naomi's MPavilion project and not just that, but also projects by other patrons of architecture are most important because they bring architecture into the lexicon. So people get the benefit of going to the MPavilion and engaging with architecture at times without even realising it, but simply because they're there for an event.
Yes.
And that's quite a powerful thing to do, particularly in a country that doesn't have architecture as an investment, or the community doesn't see architecture as an investment in our culture. Like you might encounter in Italy, for example, where after 2,000 years, they understand that it's actually a really important thing. We should have kept Utzon around so he could finish his building in Sydney rather than drive him out of the country and not let him ever see the finished product.
Yeah.
So we're still kind of making those errors. What we don't understand in Australia architecturally, we deride, and that's a pity.
Yeah.
Because we're better than that.
What you will recognise, of course, is that Naomi as a client is one of those rare clients.
Yeah.
Has given architects the opportunity of doing something that is very potentially very special.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a fandango. It can be something that's calm, that has a serenity about it, that is logical, but it also can be beautiful, and it can be operable. It can change and develop and do things. And Naomi has given that opportunity, and she has selected a group of people that are, in a sense, experimenting with some of those things.
America has a great culture of patronage in the arts and architecture that, is deeply invested in serving the community as well. I mean, the great patrons of architecture in America usually exist in public buildings where we look to our governments to provide them. In America, they're often privately funded, but gifted to the public.
Yeah.
So we've still got a ways to go. And whether we ever get to that point, I'm not sure.
But they also have their share of rubbish.
Oh, sure. Everyone does.
And when it's bad, it's really bad as well.
It's interesting that these things are running in parallel. So in the midst of the pandemic, there was the tragedy in America, and that galvanised people in a different way. And until then, people had been galvanised about the virus. Suddenly, there's another issue there, and so I hope it turns out for the best. I think it probably will. As
Australians, we've had a bit of a battering, haven't we, since last November, really December, with the fires. Then came the floods that put the fires out, that also made floods. And then the pandemic now. It's been a real hit for many of us. I mean, recall the smoke that came into the cities, equivalent to each person smoking 40 cigarettes a day. There were days like that. It was shocking.
It was day after day as well. It wasn't just a day.
No, day after day. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And we've taken a battering on this. And I think that when we can get through all of this, we can have a bit of quietness, settle down, and work out what are our real priorities.
Yeah. No, it's true. There's a desire for something soothing and calming.
Yeah.
And not the violence of nature and the violence of humanity. And I think a lot of people are hankering for just that calmness that comes, or the serenity that comes with all of that, the opposite of what we've been through.
As Barragan once said, any work of architecture that is designed without serenity in mind is, in my view, a mistake. And when serenity possesses joy, it is ultimate. And I think that goes for our cities, goes for our squares, our parks. You can have exciting things, but the idea of serenity is so important.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about before about architecture yelling too loudly, that not every square metre of a piece of architecture needs to be architecture.
That's right.
Some of it can be just absolutely non-architecture, so that when you arrive at that moment in the building that's interesting, it's emphasised and exaggerated. Not every single bit has to be yelling architecture. And it's the same in nature. You know, when you go for a walk through the bush and then you come to a stream or a waterfall, it's the contrast between the serenity of the bush and the drama of the moment.